So as people are coming in slowly to today's webinar on zero carbon buildings in cities, a whole life cycle approach, well, I will introduce the subject briefly, or won't introduce it. Really, I'm just going to say that how excited I am that we can discuss this really ambitious target that several cities in the OECD are pursuing, and we are very lucky to hear first my colleague Marie Hanagata, who's authored and led the work for that report. But after that, we are going to hear experts from Helsinki, from Vancouver, from France, and from Germany. And they will tell us how they are approaching the issue. So I think it's going to be a very interesting hour or so. We will also have time to discuss and take your questions a little bit later. So be prepared for lots of information and fun, I'm sure. So without further ado, Marie, Hanagata, I give you the screen and the floor, and we're looking forward to hearing what you worked out with your delegates on zero emission buildings in cities and regions.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicola. Hello, everyone. I'm Marie Hanagata, a policy analyst at the OECD. So today I would like to share some key findings from the recent OECD report on whole life carbon of buildings, and to also help setting the scene for this webinar. Next, please. So why whole life carbon of buildings matters? As you may know, buildings and construction account for 37% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, and of this, 9% comes from embodied carbon, which is emitted from all the activities related to construction of buildings, including production of materials, transportation, as well as renovation and demolition of a building. So this embodied carbon currently represents 25% of total emissions from building sector, but it is expected to increase to 50% by 2050 due to improved energy efficiency and the increase of renewable energy use. So, and this also affects the shift of policy priorities in many countries. According to the OECD Global Monitoring Report, which we published last year, many surveyed countries reported that future policy priorities will shift from operational carbon to embodied carbon and circularity of building materials. Next, please. Against this backdrop, we launched the OECD report on whole life carbon of buildings in February this year. And this report is supported by a survey that we conducted across 11 countries and 7 cities, as listed here. And while the level of progress varies, all of these countries and cities are leading in addressing a whole life cycle approach. Next, please. And based on the survey results, we identified key challenges in the whole life carbon approach and developed some policy recommendations by drawing on how the surveyed countries and cities are addressing these issues. The first recommendation is to take step-by-step approach. The bar graph shows the main challenges identified by the survey respondents at the policy development stage. The biggest challenge faced by them was setting reference and limit values, which is followed by development of database and deciding on the scope of assessment. And addressing all of these challenges requires some time to collect data and conduct some preliminary study. And so it highlights the need for a step-by-step approach and preparation for the actual implementation of regulatory measures. Next, please. This is also evident in the policy timelines of leading countries and cities, as shown in this chart. The dark red shows the regulatory phase, while the pink represents the preparation phase. Although the length of the preparation phase varies, in all cases, it took around at least 2 years of groundwork before regulatory measures were put in place. Next, please. And this kind of step-by-step approach also appears in how they implement regulatory measures, but in different ways depending on the countries or city. For example, in Sweden, the process began with mandatory reporting of upfront carbon only, but it applied to all building types. On the other hand, France took a different path by introducing limit values for whole life cycle right from the beginning, but only applies to some building types such as residential, office, and school buildings. Denmark follows a similar approach to France, but instead of differentiating by building type, their requirements vary depending on the size of the building. These differences show how countries and cities are taking feasibility, effectiveness, and priorities into account when planning a step-by-step approach in their context. Next, please. So the second policy recommendation is to leverage data and digital tools. This graph shows the main challenges reported by survey respondents at the policy implementation stage. The biggest challenge was the additional workload involved in whole life carbon calculations, and the second biggest was the lack of EPD data. Next, please. Reducing workload can be tackled by developing digital whole life carbon assessment tools that integrate with building information models, BIM models. And the lack of EPD data can be addressed through policies such as incentives or regulatory measures. For example, Denmark, Finland, France, and Sweden have set national generic emission data slightly higher than the actual averages or benchmarks. This encourages manufacturers to obtain EPDs to prove their products have lower emissions. And the graph on the slide shows the growth in the number of EPDs in France over time. And you can clearly see how policy measures have contributed to the increase of the number of the EPDs. Next, please. And the third recommendation is to promote city-led initiatives. Our survey revealed that collaboration across levels of government is lacking. Only 4 out of 11 surveyed national governments answered that they had platforms to coordinate with subnational governments. And only 2 out of 7 city governments responded that they receive enough support for capacity building and technical assistance from the national government. Next, please. However, cities present a great opportunity in accelerating whole life carbon initiatives by leveraging their local advantages. And these advantages specifically include that cities own buildings and land where they can impose ambitious policy measures, and some cities are authorized to set their own regulations or requirements, and cities are close to citizens and local businesses to enable effective public-private partnerships. So given that promoting local initiatives, leveraging them as test beds, and scaling up these best practices will help effective and successful implementation of whole life carbon policies. Next, please. So here is an example of from Helsinki that exemplifies the strong national and subnational cooperation. We will have Hannah from Helsinki right after my presentation, so I won't talk too much, but they implemented limit value requirement for apartment buildings in 2023 ahead of nationwide implementation by using assessment methodology developed by the national government. So this is a good example that can serve as a practical demonstration of the assessment methodology and regulatory measures before its broader application at the national level. So next, please. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was quick, but those were some of the key findings from our reports. And if you would like to learn more, please scan the QR code and visit our website where you can download all the series of reports. That's all from me, and over to Nicola. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Marie. I have one question before I call on the next speaker for, non-experts. What exactly is this EPD data that's
Oh,
difficult
yes.
to have?
That is environmental product declaration, which is basically a sort of certification that manufacturer can obtain for their product that shows all the environmental impact data, including GHG emissions and so on. Yeah.
Because it's not easy to calculate embodied emissions, right?
Yes,
So sure
exactly.
it's
Yeah.
about that. Yeah. Sure, it's difficult to have the data. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Marie. And now, as Marie already announced or hinted, we have Hanna Wesslin, who's the climate director of the city of Helsinki. And we already heard that Helsinki has a lot of experience with this whole of life cycle approach. So we are curious to hear what you have to tell us, Hannah. over to you.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Marie, also for the introduction. And I'm happy to provide you more in-depth story of the whole life carbon development in Helsinki, and maybe some nuances that might not be so obvious. So on to the next slide. This is indeed the timeline that Marie also already shared, but just wanted to let you know that the preparation did take quite a while. So the discussion started already back in 2017 by developing the database on the national level. The city, however, was really eager to move on and kind of acknowledge that probably the national level legislation will come at a point. But since we have so much in our power as the kind of a monopoly in planning in the city, this is a golden opportunity for us to act. But to set the limit value was indeed one of the challenges. And what we did is that we went through over 60 buildings that the city had built, and did the calculations for those to be able to understand what the average is and where to set the standard. Then we, of course, talked to the market, created also some excitement with a competition for a green urban block that was both architecturally ambitious as well as aimed for as low as possible whole life carbon measure. And it created actually a bunch of really good proposals, and not just one, but 3 of them are being built now, and all of them came to the same low values with very different technological solutions. That just comes to show that it does give room for invention. And then in 2023, we did set the limit value for apartment buildings. At the moment, we are at the phase where in the beginning of next year, in 2026, the national level limit value will come into place. And it will also apply to other building types, not just residential buildings. However, even before that, so our limit value was 16.0. That's CO2 per kilograms of CO2 per year over a 50-year cycle. Our limit value in 23 was that. Now the national level value in 26 will be 16 as well. However, just half a year ago, since the emission factors from the energy use phase, like Marie was also explaining, have gone down quite significantly. Also the case in Finland. So the emission factors were lower. So we wanted to keep the guiding force of our limit as strong as it has been. So we needed to tighten the value down to 14. So now we're at the phase where the national level will be 16 and we are at 14 for residential buildings. Interesting. And if you just click on the next one, this is really, the kind of the dilemma, or maybe it's not a dilemma, but interesting discussion. We have a national one and a city one. The city is actually, all bigger cities in Finland see that the national level target is extremely relaxed and it doesn't really incentivize anything. But I think maybe it's for the learning process, I guess, the beginning. But, since we have already practiced and learned for 2 years, this seems, the national level does seem unambitious. What we have also understood with this experience so far is that the limit value does set a minimum. But however, we keep hearing from the sector that they could do much more. So the companies are actually having their own limit values that are lower than the city value. And they would like to be, rewarded for their good work. At the moment, we only have the limit and doesn't give you any incentives. So that's one question. And thirdly, with the development of the construction materials and technologies and the need to make sure that we actually take out carbon from the atmosphere, we also now think a lot about handprint, because this is really about the footprint. But what about any carbon that is maybe stored in the buildings, like carbon negative concrete or things like that we have already experimented with? And the limit value at the moment doesn't really take that into account, and we have to find other ways to incentivize that too. But moving on to the next one. So just to demonstrate how big of a difference it really is with the renewable energy coming into heating as well as electricity. So this is the emissions from in Helsinki from 1990 all the way to the projections until 2030. As you can see, heating has been the biggest source of emissions, and district heating is our way to heat buildings. However, we just this year closed the last coal-fired power plant in Helsinki and also the last one in Finland at the same time. This reduced the emissions in the city by 30% and even national level by 2%. So these are huge changes. And we are really on our kind of all emission level targets are pretty, this is really good for that. But if you move into the next slide, exactly as Marie was saying, is that when we look at the building sector, you can see that the material sector will be so much more important in the future than the energy use, and it's really imperative that we start using more low carbon products. It's a reuse of components, reuse of materials, recycled products, carbon negative products, low carbon products. The Green Building Council of Finland, which has produced this analysis, also analyzed that the current national level, or the 2026 national level limit value, reduces the sector's emissions by 0.5%. So I think that is it's a reduction, but it's a very small number, and we feel that as a city we want to be more ambitious than that. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Hanna. That's I have 100 questions, but I think we are, well, in particular how you did that with the district heating. But of course, we're looking at the full life cycle. But we are moving that to later, and we now have Zara Teshnisi, who's a senior planner specialized in embodied carbon. I understand at the city of Vancouver, and I think it's before 7 o'clock in the morning for Zara. So we are particularly happy to have you here, Zara, and to hear how you're making progress in Vancouver. Over to you.
Thanks so much, and pleasure is mine, truly. I'm very excited for being here. I'm already learning a lot from the first two presentations, and looking forward to our discussion. So as mentioned, I'm Zara Teshnisi. I'm a senior planner at the City of Vancouver within our planning department. So today I just wanted to go through what we have done to date, both on the regulatory side, but also the incentive side on adding whole life carbon into our equation, essentially. Next slide. As Marie mentioned, a lot of these needs a lot of groundwork. And so Vancouver actually has started to require embodied carbon reporting, which is emissions from all the stages of the building emissions other than operation, since 2017 as part of our rezoning requirements, which basically ask it from larger projects that require to change zone. That kind of laid the groundwork for us to be able to add embodied carbon to our climate emergency action plan, which was released back in 2020 and identified major actions that city could take and has control on to achieve our climate targets. And we call them big moves. And Big Move 5 focuses on low carbon materials and construction practices. We set an ambitious target to reduce the embodied carbon of new buildings by 40% by 2030. And that kind of, next slide. So that basically to do that, we also develop an embodied carbon strategy, which looks at various actions that they can take to meet that target. That includes things like changing the regulations and code, which Vancouver is fortunate to have its own building code. So we have more flexibility than the typical city in North America. Also looking into how we could remove barriers in our processes, we can provide incentives, which essentially helps the market, and also how to coordinate with different levels of government, advocate for alignment to ease the process for the industry and provide knowledge sharing and training. And lastly, also look into how we could integrate our approaches and leverage other policies and priorities that the city has. So, for example, how we design our neighborhoods, or our zero waste targets, or our underground parkade requirements, and so on. So again, it's a package that was used to envision how we can get to that. Next slide. So looking at the regulatory part, basically, as Marie mentioned, back in 2020, when the Climate Emergency Action Plan was released, one of the biggest gap we had was having a framework that we could standardize embodied carbon reporting. So there are lots of standards out there, like the EN standard, the ISO standard, and there was actually one that was released maybe back in 2022 in Canada. However, the challenge with those was that the scope was still quite flexible to the judgment of the person who does the assessment. So our team worked with the industry with a lot of feedback from leading industry members from across North America and even globally, to develop an embodied carbon guidelines for City of Vancouver. One of the huge leaps that we were successful in implementing, which kind of touches on how cities and national governments can work, is that our national government actually went ahead and adopted this series of guidelines that we published as the Canadian National Whole Building and Life Cycle Assessment Practitioners Guide. And then Vancouver went ahead just this year and updated our reference in code to this national guide with an addendum for the City of Vancouver, which allows some specific things that wasn't included in the national one to allow for broader adoption, but also some innovation in it, so which I'll touch later on. And maybe I would also mention that the Canadian federal government also is working toward adding embodied carbon to the national model code for 2030. And we are fortunate that I'm on the task group, so it's great to make sure that what we are learning is informing the national model code as well. So on what Vancouver has in the building code, as our building code is called Vancouver Building Bylaw. So since October 2023, we have been asking all larger buildings. So I in this slide it shows part 3, which in national code basically part 2 refers to larger buildings, to report their whole building life cycle assessment following that guide, which now is referring to the national one. And we started with a preliminary easy limit, which is a double of a benchmark. So what was huge in what we were achieving through those guidelines was that we developed a very specific way to define a baseline, given that we didn't have rigorous absolute targets, embodied carbon intensity targets. And the guidelines essentially allows 2 pathways. One is an intensity pathway, which we have chosen the value of 400, using the submissions we have received from rezoning from 2017 all the way to 2023, and then a baseline path, which is a functionally equivalent baseline building. Next slide. Oh, maybe I'll also mention that. Oh, actually, I can talk about it in the next slide as well. So basically, so as I mentioned, we provided 2 pathways and we picked one absolute benchmark number, which is 400. We took it from the submissions, on rezoning submissions, which we have received. And then essentially we would basically, any reduction comes from that. So what we had proposed was from 2025 to require our first reduction of 10% from the benchmark. which is delayed. So we haven't taken this to council, even though it is approved in principle by council back in 2022. We haven't taken it to council for final implementation. And that comes with a lot of challenges that industry is facing. And I don't think that's limited to Vancouver. So we can get on that later. But essentially, what the reason we picked that 10% and also that 400 benchmark is that if you look at our low-rise wood buildings on the left, you will see that majority of the projects as submitted today are meeting that absolute limit. So essentially, they do not really need to do much other than assessing and reporting. But then if you look at the high-rise concrete, the third from the left, majority of them are above that absolute limit. So next slide. Basically, we understand that these are more sophisticated projects, and we expected those to actually go through the baseline path. So showing relative reduction from the proposed design rather than that absolute number. So again, like what we understood is that this 10% reduction, initial reduction, is not as challenging. Despite that, we are still delaying it for a proper time to go ahead with it. Next slide. So let's talk about a little bit about enabling by removing barriers and providing incentives. So first of all, we understand that our neighborhood planning play a key role in allowing low embodied carbon buildings. So through our neighborhood and village plannings within the city, essentially, this is one example, Broadway plan, which allows mid-density, like say 4 to 12 story, which now through our code is allowed to be built with mass timber, up to 6-story wood frame build also allows for wood frame buildings. So that is essentially allowing lower carbon structure. And then also we are allowing for simpler forms. And also, we have removed the minimum parkade requirements. Broadway plan did it before city did it citywide. So again, all of these to enable reduction. Next slide. We also have provided incentive for mass timber buildings specifically. So our code was updated just a couple of years ago to allow building mass timber up to 18 stories, encapsulated mass timber. And then also we provided additional incentives at rezoning. So projects that go for changing their building zone and go through rezoning process are able to request an additional 2 to 3 stories depending on their height. Next slide. We also provided incentives specifically for low-rise homes through a program that we previously initiated for operational carbon, but was expanded to as a new stream to have embodied carbon. So providing financial incentive for 30% plus reduction in exchange for data. So we have actually collected very valuable data from about 25 projects that are in this program, which will help us inform low-rise code approach later on. To the right, you can see a study that we did a few years ago that actually shows the significance opportunity of low-rise buildings to incorporate carbon storing materials or biomaterials and can show on average from what's currently available more than 40% reduction. And then beyond that, it's shown to go all the way close to 100% or sometimes carbon storing depending on the type of the building. Next slide. And so I mentioned that we have an addendum to our national guide, which allows us to encourage and maybe pilot some of the more innovative approaches. One of the ones that we are quite proud of, and maybe we haven't seen the impact yet, but when we move toward reduction and providing more incentives, that will be showing itself well, is that we are allowing to account for biogenic carbon, not for all biomaterials, specifically excluding wood because of the challenges for ensuring that the biogenic carbon is accounted correctly in it, but for all the other biomaterials that essentially using byproducts or otherwise waste streams or materials that have a short growth cycle. So this essentially allows to encourage more using of these materials in practice. Next slide. We also have, through that addendum, we have provided a set of optional credits. So projects that want to go above and beyond and report on elements that we have not sufficient data on today. For example, in the databases in North America, we are missing on mechanical, electrical, plumbing emissions. So we actually give credit, assuming that then the resulting in less reduction requirement if projects go ahead and choose to report these, not reduce it, because we don't have enough data. So just getting that data is valuable. We are also providing in the similar credit for reuse and circularity practices, which cannot currently be accounted through the whole building life cycle assessment methodology. For example, salvaging from the site, but not reusing it on the same site or designed for disassembly. Next slide. So this is a schematic view of how we have seen the work we have done. So we right now we are working mostly on ensuring that industry is familiar, case studies are coming out, incentives are being developed, barriers are removed to hopefully be able to take our first reduction step beginning of 20, I mean, I wouldn't say beginning of, we'll see how fast it can go, but like taking the first reduction requirements to council either later this year or early next year, again, pending the work with the industry and ensuring that the industry is ready for that step, and then taking next steps in future. However, on the background, we are doing a lot of work, like, for example, it was talk about like the databases. So we are doing a lot of foundational work while waiting for taking that to council. So when the time is ready, we have the tools and resources we need. I believe that was my last slide. So thanks.
And thank you, Zara. And before I give the floor to our next speaker, I do have, because I'm trying to make the connections, and I have one question to better understand what you just told us. So my question is low-rise building. What is that, Zara?
Yeah, thanks for asking for the clarification. So in Vancouver, essentially, a lot of the buildings that are under 3-story and they're under 1,800 square meter are considered as actually have a different approach in code because they have different kind of builders. But then also beyond that, up to 6-story in Vancouver are allowed to be built with wood frame, not mass timber, wood frame. And then beyond that is where we require, if we need to be built with wood, we need to use mass timber. So that distinction is key in kind of how we are incentivizing low carbon construction.
Okay, brilliant. And then I want, if I may, I just want to very briefly take a step back to Hannah's presentation, because Hannah, you told us, you gave us these showed us these massive reductions you achieved, but then you said, well, there's this tension, right, between I don't know how you call it, requirements and incentives, and how to incentivize. And I was just wondering some of the things that Zara now told us, for example, the incentives, industry leadership incentives, where it seems, I don't know, do you give them some financial help if they go a bit farther? I was just thinking back to Hannah, who said, well, the industry tells us we can do much more, but you don't really have a tool to incentivize them. So is this a place where you can learn from each other?
Hannah raised wonderful points, and we have heard exactly similar. There are industry representatives that are very worried about how this is not the right time to ask for even the slightest amount of reduction, to Hannah's point, maybe not really a meaningful reduction, which exactly why we are delaying our 10%. But on the other side, we have industry members that come to us and say, we are already doing 20%. Why aren't you celebrating those that are doing more? So again, we have a financial incentive program for lower rise building, which is more of a pilot study because it's not offered broadly, but we are currently exploring other sorts of incentives for both low-rise and high-rise buildings. This is just early in development, and essentially it looks into, for low-rise, allowing for additional floor space if they can prove a significant reduction of embodied carbon. And I mentioned our mass timber incentive, which allows additional floor area. Floor levels, and we are exploring. Again, this is very early on, and this is at the concept level, but potentially could we offer something similar for very low embodied carbon buildings, say 40% reduction, to kind of show us the way.
And Hannah, you're looking for solutions like that, is that correct? Or
yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that we'll be starting working on after the summer break, really, to figure out a way, because we have done something similar in infrastructure construction. So there we have some incentives for low carbon end result. So I would be really happy to exchange some thoughts later on with Vancouver on how we have done that.
well,
For sure.
we have more time for the discussion, so we'll do that. But before that, we have more experts from different countries who can tell us how they are approaching the problem. And now that we saw like two front runner cities, Vancouver and Helsinki, we are moving to a country that tends to steer these things from the center, from Paris. So we have Vincent Lapeyre, and he's not representing his city. He's he's a project manager at the Ministry of Ecological Transition, Energy, Climate, and Risk Prevention, and that's also responsible for housing. Ministries are changing a little bit at the moment. So, Vincent, we're looking forward to to hearing more about the French approach to.
Thank you, Nicola, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So I will be presenting what is done in France in terms of environmental regulations for buildings at national level. So the process of making it and also how it works. So first of all, the regulation I'm talking about is RE 2020, Environmental Regulation 2020, which is the latest child in the family of thermal regulations in France. And it's the first one to tackle both energy efficiency and global warming potential of buildings. So to implement these big changes, the introduction of RE 2020 was preceded by a lot of work. So first, an experimental phase to introduce a life cycle analysis method and to build up skills and generate feedback from the stakeholders. So it was the national certification, which was called E+C-. So based on this work, group of experts then specified the methodologies that would be used for the future regulation. And then a modeling group then gathered data from this E+C- to do other simulations and then select indicators and propose limit values on these indicators. So since 2022, this new regulation gradually replaced the previous regulation, which was RT 2012. So it now applies for residential, office, and primary and secondary education buildings. Next slide, please. So our next step now is to roll out the RE 2020 to new buildings not yet subjected to this regulation. So these are the other tertiary and industrial buildings. So now we have, here you have the base of the methodology we use. So we select a panel of buildings, we do modeling, environmental modeling and energy modeling of these buildings to set the limit values. And then we consult the stakeholders to see if there is any problem with that, and we change a bit the values, and then it goes into effect. So here you have the 10 types of building that we are studying now. So right now we are at near the publication of the decree, which will implement this regulation for this type of building. We are actually currently doing the mandatory consultations. So next slide, please. So to come back about the objectives of the regulation RE 2020, so it both tackles energy sobriety and energy decarbonation, and also the reduction of the carbon footprint of buildings. And the third pillar of the RE 2020 is to ensure the comfort of these buildings during heat waves. So there are three pillars to RE 2020. When it comes to carbon footprint, so there is an assessment of the carbon footprint through LCA, so life cycle analysis, using a different method that is often used. It's a dynamic method, simplified dynamic method. I will come back to it later. So these requirements that are applied to the carbon part of RE 2020, are reinforced every 3 years through different milestones. So the first one is easy to get. So 2020 was easy to achieve. And between 2025 and 2020 and 2031, it is increased a bit every 3 years. So in 2031, it will be between 30 and 40% tighter than in 2022. Okay, so next slide, please. So as I said, the RE 2020 is based on main indicators that are associated with a limit value. For the carbon part, we have IC construction and IC energy. So IC construction is about embodied carbon, and IC energy is about energy consumption. Next slide, please. When it comes to the perimeter of buildings, so of building parts, so the assessment is done on a reference study period of 50 years, and it takes into account all the building components, including systems, ventilation, energy, communication networks, etc. So everything is accounted in the LCA. And also the construction site impact is calculated separately, but is part of the final indicator, IC construction. And next slide, please. When it comes to the scope of lives of parts of the life cycles, it covers globally all the life cycle of the building. So from the product stage to the demolition stage, including also the beyond boundaries, so valorization through the module D, what we call module D. So in green, you have what is accounted for in IC construction, in the indicator IC construction, and in blue, what is accounted for in IC energy. So it's operational carbon associated with energy consumption. And then you have B7, which is calculated. So it's operational water. So the impact of water use in the building, which is calculated but not associated with a limit value. Next slide, please. So this is how a little explanation of how the limit is set. So you have a flat value, a mean value. So it's IC construction max moyen. So it's the mean value that is then modulated according to different specificities of the project. This allows to have the same level of levers to have to put into place in your project. So everybody is impacted by this regulation the same amount. So it modulates for different characteristics of the project. I won't go into details here, but yeah. So next slide, please. So here you have the limit values for IC construction. So for embodied carbon, for each types of building and each year. So, well, we go next slide, please. Yeah, no need to go into more details about that. So we focus more about the specificity of RE 2020, which is its dynamic approach, which is new from the beginning of the. First, it was a static approach as broadly used as in standards, European standards 15978, for example. But we decided to adjust these standards and to differ a bit from them to take into account the stored carbon. Also, we believe that it's an approach that is more in phase with what's at stake, which is the urgency of climate to tackle climate change. So this approach gives more weight to emissions that occur at the beginning of the life cycle than the emissions at the later in the life cycle. So it allows, for example, bio-based material to perform better in these calculations. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here we have an example for timber beam, a specific product. For example, at the left side of the table, you have the values, the life cycle values for the product in the EPD, so in the declaration. And then you have the modulated version at the right side, and you see that it performs better with the dynamic approach. So on the graph on the right side of the slide, you have the dynamic factor that is applied depending on the year of the emission in the calculations. So for example, the emissions from the demolition of the building is accounted for only 58% of its original value, for example. So next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about the tools that are in place for stakeholders to perform the LCA. So to carry out the LCA for their projects, project owners have access to different types of tools. So first there is the database, which is called INES here, that contains all the available and up-to-date data on projects, equipments, and construction materials. So there is specific data produced by manufacturers. There is also default values produced by the ministry, and service data for example, to calculate IC energy, you have to have the conversion of 1 kilowatt hour per hour in CO2. So this is the first tool that is available. So these environmental data, the specific ones produced by the manufacturers, must be verified by an independent third party, which is the audit programs here. You have FDES, INES program for all the projects that are not systems. And then for the systems, there you have PEP EcoPassport. So both programs verify the data that is produced, and then with a collaboration with our ministry to have a standard to meet with some standards, and then the data can be used for the regulation. So then there is the RCA softwares that connect to INES database to carry out the building LCA. So these software generate a standardized summary file for energy and environmental studies. So in these softwares, you often have the part that calculates the energy consumption and also the part that calculates the carbon footprint of your building. So everything is then summarized in a standard file that is then collected by authorities. So first, there is a first version that is collected at the building permits, and then the latest one is collected at the completion of works. And then after that, it's added to a national observatory to then do analysis. Maybe later we will use this data to control if the regulation is well applied. So next slide, please. So as I said, it's collected on an observatory. So this observatory has three main objectives. So first is a transparent monitoring of public policy by making it possible to track changes in construction performance and to identify trends in terms of technical solutions employed. So it's very useful for that. Then it provides input for discussions on changes to public policies relating to building industry by creating a common technical reference framework for the sector and producing analysis that can be then widely distributed. And also to support the development of skills throughout the sector by making it possible to identify relevant solutions and share experience and ideas. So it's very fruitful, and soon we will release an open data database of all the projects who are actually working on it. So it will be easier to do analysis for all the stakeholders. So that's the last thing I'm going to talk about. So thank you for your attention. And I'll now leave the floor to
Brilliant.
Nicolas.
Thanks, Vincent. There's Sarah had a spontaneous question to you, and perhaps it's a good moment to bring it up.
Okay.
She's asking whether FTS INE and the PEP Eco Passport, the ones that you just presented, whether they are run by independent parties or are they run by you, the government?
No, they are run by the industrial manufacturers.
Okay.
They have their hands on it, but they have a convention with us.
Okay.
To
so you basically
meet with some
agree on some
standards.
standards. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you talked about a WeBe LCA database, and she was wondering, is that accessible to everybody or just to you, the government?
No, so the observatory is accessible for everyone.
Mhm.
And soon the open data database of all the projects will be also on open data.
Okay, well,
So
that sounds good.
very soon, in few
Bravo.
weeks or months, I don't know.
Well, that's great. More food for learning from each other. And now
Yeah.
we have a last presentation before we move on to asking each other questions. And that is Stephan Anders, who's the Director of Network and Consulting at the German Sustainable Building Council. Stephan, the floor is yours. We're very curious now to learn what works in Germany and perhaps what doesn't work. So let's see how it's done here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, perfect. So yes, as a maybe can skip to the next slide. So I'm from the Green Building Council in Germany. There are also a lot of other green building councils around the world with different certification schemes. So not from a governmental side, so a non-profit organization with around 2,800 members. With that, we are the biggest European network for sustainable building. And what we developed after we founded 2007 certification scheme for green buildings, but also for whole districts, industrial sites, in interiors. And on the next slide, You can see here a short overview about our assessment theme for buildings. And one important criteria for us is building life cycle assessment. There, I think we have a really good expertise. It was still the starting point for the whole development to build such criteria, also develop databases on the national level. As we started, we don't have anything, and everybody told us that's not possible to calculate CO2 emissions for a whole building, maybe for a pencil, but not for a whole building. It was interesting, and it's still an important topic for us, but you see also a lot of other aspects we think it's important for a sustainable building. And the next slide, one slide about German sustainability and especially climate protection goals. Maybe you know, in Europe, we have the goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. And in Germany, we have a little bit more ambitious goal to be carbon neutral at 2045. You see here on the right and on the left, more or less, where we are at the moment. So there still is a lot to do, and we are active here in different fields, in energy industries, buildings, transport, and agriculture. And especially for buildings, at the moment, there's no mandatory goal you have to fulfill to get the building permission. We see that from our partners in Denmark, for example. There is the case. In Germany, we have a little bit other approach. It's more about funding. And on the next slides, you can see here subsidies or financial support for climate-friendly construction. So if you focus, if you plan a new building on CO2 emissions, there are different limit values I will show you later. And on energy, then you can have for one residential unit 100,000 euros as a grant, where you don't have to pay so much to the bank. So it's not that you get 100,000 euro for only one unit. And for non-residential, there's also another number. If you even do CO2 friendly construction and also focus on the other criteria I showed you before, then there's another funding scheme for climate friendly construction. Then you can even have 150,000. Yeah? So this is the idea, to give money to developers who want to do it in a more sustainable way. It still started 2 years ago, so it's still rising. There are not that much buildings for the moment, but it's getting more and more. And for official buildings, there is still, it's mandatory if they are bigger or it costs more than 5 million euros, and it's more or less all official bigger buildings, then it's mandatory to have the sustainability seal for the building. Okay, and then the next slides, you can see, okay, how it works. So our government define here a minimum criteria. In the German Anforderungen DGNB, Anforderungen des DGNB QNG Plus. It means there are minimum criteria for CO2 emissions, but also for barrier-free design and others I will show you later. And because it's only minimum criteria, they say it has to be in combination with the accepted certificate in Germany. So we are certified 80% of all buildings in Germany, but there are also some smaller German other rating schemes. They also have the possibility to make the proof of this of the Anforderung on the right side. So this is the idea in general. So you as a developer or somebody who wants to build a building, you have to, if you want to have the maximum financial support, then you have to certify your building with DGNB. And part of this certification process is also to show that the minimum requirements are fulfilled. On the next slide, here you see this minimum criteria what the German government have defined. So one of it is greenhouse gas and primary energy. I will show you later more in detail. But we also focus on sustainable material extraction. So where the materials are coming from. If you use wood, then it should come from sustainable sources. We also focus on pollutants in building materials, VOCs and other chemicals who may be not so good for your health. Accessibility or barrier-free design. Also, you have to analyze natural hazards on this site, like too much water, too much rain, and then how you deal with this risks you have. And and you also have to build a green roof if it's possible for the roof. So these are the minimum criteria. And in the next slide, you can see the values for the greenhouse gas emissions. So there you have to do a calculation for the whole life cycle. So that means you have to calculate CO2 emissions for construction, but also for operation. There's a complex definition how to do that. And in the end, you have to be lower than 24 kilogram per square meter and year for, I think that's for residential buildings. At the moment, there's also a premium variant where you have to fulfill even 20 kilogram per square meter, but for the moment, it's not mandatory for the funding. Maybe in the future, they will decide there's something different. And next to the CO2 emissions, you also have to fulfill a minimum energy performance at the end from 96 kilowatt hour per square meter for the building. So yeah, these are the values. It's always important to, if you only look to the values, to understand also what is the definition behind, because if you look to our partners in Denmark, for example, the value there is, I think 11 kilograms, but this is not include the operational CO2 emissions, for example. So this is also maybe important, maybe also later if we come to discussion. Okay.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
yeah, this I have
not
two slides
sorry.
more. So only to understand maybe the context also in Europe. In Europe, there's also so-called EU taxonomy. That means that are also criteria for every kind of investment, not only buildings, also for agriculture, infrastructure, and so on. And there you also have to fulfill some minimum criteria, and one of that is also climate change mitigation. And the same, yeah, CO2 emissions calculation. And at the moment, we offer here also the possibility for investors, if they certify their building with DGNB, then we also check if the EU taxonomy criteria are fulfilled, because more and more banks and investors are asking for that. Is the building also the EU taxonomy conform next to the DGNB certification? So also here, CO2 emissions getting more and more in focus. On the next slide, yeah, you see here our offer to make also here such a third-party review of the EU taxonomy criteria. And on the next slide, another topic also, it's also still voluntary. It's EU reporting tool levels. Also here, EU Parliament defined here criteria for sustainable buildings. So this is even more than only focus on CO2 emissions. You see here on the right side. This is also we try to integrate in our DGNB system. It's still voluntary, but we see for public buildings, often they ask also if the levels criteria are fulfilled, or you even report to this standard. So this is one approach what we have, maybe on the last slide, to integrate such themes like levels. Maybe we can go one slide further, like levels and taxonomy in our rating scheme, that at the end, the investor know that if he certifies a building with DGNB, then he also fulfill other regulations. It should be maybe here on the last slide, you can see it. Yeah, so you can see here one more time. So sustainability in construction sector is big, although we not include everything in our system. but what we include here is also levels, the German GtCO₂e, and also part of the EU taxonomy. Okay, thank you. I hope we can give you an overview how we deal with the topic in Germany.
Great, Stephan.
you.
I just have one question now because, well, you were talking about EU taxonomy, and I was trying to understand. So the DGNB, the Sustainable Building Council that you represent, are you the standard setter for Germany in that area? Is that right? So do you set national standards, or how does it work in Germany? Because it sounded a lot like Vincent. So in France, it's pretty much central, right? What's being done? How does it work in Germany?
Yeah, we are more the standard setter for the market. So the investors and developers believe in our certification standard, but it's totally free and it's a big discussion process with all our members how the standard look like. We not work together with the German government. Sometimes they ask for a question regarding sustainable building and how to do that, but we are not directly involved. And on the EU level, sometimes also there we are invited to get feedback. For example, if they publish the first version of this EU taxonomy draft, we ask also our members if they are interested to make the testing of this criteria on the first projects, and we have done this. And this feedback, what we learned there, we give back to the Commission, but we are not directly involved in the process. If we were, we would make some criteria a little bit different and more aligned to the GMB system. That's not the case, fortunately, at the moment.
So basically, you depend on industry buying into your standards. Yeah, you're trying
Yes.
to like DIN or something.
Like
Okay,
also other rating schemes like LEED or BREEAM, maybe you heard.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. But now my colleague Jisoo, well, she also has I see a couple of questions building on your presentation. So Jisoo, please, yeah, now you can further ignite the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you, everyone. It's really great to see all of your faces. Actually, my name is Jisoo Yoon. I'm a policy analyst at the OECD, and together with Marie, actually, we co-authored this report, Zero Carbon Buildings in Cities. And actually, Nicola, I'm actually very conscious of the time because I thought that we have about like 10 minutes left. So I'm not sure if it's a great idea to go over each and every question, or instead, probably I can just go one single question and then maybe I invite our presenters to jump in if they think it's relevant. Because I think it was really interesting to see how different cities and countries have different approaches actually to tackle one single thing at the end of the day, the buildings. And it was very interesting also from Helsinki how they're always ahead of the national government to set the limit values. And it was really exciting to see that the 16 kilogram limit value has become 14 kilograms, which is very ambitious and very front running. And also for Vancouver, I mean, your idea on Big Five and also biomass incentives, as well as the timber building incentives, it's something that we always have to look on for other cities to benchmark. And also, of course, the country examples, I mean, Germany and France, I mean, I have to congratulate you because not every country at the OECD had started their approach in life cycle assessment, and you have started it in different ways. And I think it's a really fascinating and also to share with the countries that have not started whole life carbon yet. So my question, one single question for all of you is that we have different approaches. Okay, that's clear. However, we have to work together with different levels of governance. So for national governments, you have to work with local governments, and not necessarily all local governments are as champions as Helsinki or Vancouver. You also have to deal with other local governments. So I would like to know whether you have some sort of a strategies or dialogue platforms to talk with other local governments. And the same question goes to also Helsinki and Vancouver, because you have all these ambitious strategies, but you also have to work with the national government. So my one single question for all of you is that how can we facilitate this multi-level governance?
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay. I think we have a really good relationship with the national government, but what we also do is that we work with the six biggest cities in Finland to align on our approach. So I think the kind of cities and the national government, they kind of work in parallel. What I do appreciate about the national approach, that even though their 26 limit is less ambitious than I would have preferred, they have set a 28 goal, which is something that I think we should all be doing as cities that have a really clear path forward. Because even if we set something that comes in 2 years or 4 years, it will already ignite thinking in the sector and how they can achieve that. So I think that's the approach that we should do on multiple levels of government.
Yeah, Sarah, so I mean, staying with the question, but I was also wondering because you said you are lucky to have zoning laws in the hand of Vancouver, and apparently that isn't the case for other North American cities. So a bit in addition, but complementing Jisoo's question, how do cities in Canada or perhaps all across North America learn from each other in this process of going zero carbon over the life cycle?
I'm enjoying a lot of the answers that Hannah gives because we are kind of trying to replicate that in North America in a way. So yeah, there's few cities, handful cities in Canada. I'm not too sure about US, but I believe it's similar, that have their own building code or flexibility to set their own building code. So zoning and like the development zoning bylaws are more practical for the cities to enforce or incentivize such things, if although there are limits and challenges. For example, Toronto has its own green building standard, but currently they're going through a process of like the Ontario removing the red tapes and kind of like either kind of like, I don't know, risking that. So there's always this back and forth between how these policies are used. But one thing I would say is similarly, we work very closely with a lot of leading groups. So we work closely with the City of Toronto. We also have a Pacific Coast Collaborative Alliance, which is the west of America, North America, cities and provinces and states that are cross-sharing information. We actually have a very notable funding from our federal government to further advance this work. So essentially, we are getting federal funding to implement code, and essentially Vancouver can be a test bed of a lot of these before it's broadened up to the national level. And also, again, like there are some things that we include in Vancouver that may not be easy to do in the broader context. So we are trying to look at whole building LCA as a framework. Instead of limiting the scope to say upfront, we would love to take approaches similar to what France does, like bring in placeholders and then encourage data to show leadership. So that's what we are trying to do, and hoping that that's the approach that the federal government will go with the national model code that allows the holistic scope and not limiting the scope both on building elements and also life cycle stages, and then allow that as a tool for policymakers like Vancouver to encourage that. And just to clarify, when I mentioned these credits, these are very simple. Like I mentioned, the industry leadership credits that we are giving for example, reporting construction emission. These are not like as large of a credit as what I mentioned about mass timber, which is like a couple of additional floors. It's just that it reduces the reduction requirements, which are not in place yet. So a lot of these will come in place and show their impact if we are successful in proceeding setting limits, which is something that for now is a little slowing down.
Brilliant.
Right.
And I think, Jisoo, you're
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your answers. I mean, I know that we're almost at time. However, I would like to give floor to Stephan and Vincent in case we missed something from the national government.
Okay, so in France, the authority for regulations on buildings is very centralized. So the role of the local government is very reduced in the making of the regulations. They are only consulted to see if there is any blockage for applying the national regulations, but they are not part of the process of making the regulations.
Can I just, yeah, that's, I mean, France is very centrist, but I would just like to hear from Hannah. Isn't that a benefit when you have sort of a little bit of competition, or you can have front runners in the cities? Can that help to further the reductions? What do you think? Of course, it's
yeah. Well, at least in our context, it is helpful. I think we are also kind of a pilot as well. So it's a benefit to be a pilot, and we can be the ones who can, share the experience of what works and what doesn't, and also we can then be the one raising the ambition if we so see.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are some cities such as Paris who raise the bar higher that are a step ahead for the next milestone for carbon, for example. So it depends on the urban planning schemes.
Does exist.
The cities, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we are actually just on time, but Nicola, I'm not sure if you'd like to read off some of the questions on the chat.
Well, yeah, we can. Well, maybe we have some time, but it would be interesting to hear Stephan about this, right? Because it's a different dimension, and it's very German also to have an industry association that sets some standards. So maybe just if you have a thought, does it exist in Germany that there are front runners at the city level or at the regional level?
Yes, there are.
How does it compare?
Cities like Heidelberg or even Munich, they are still try to push new topics and to show what is possible, and although other cities learn from that. That's always the case. In Munich, for example, there's also one wooden district I know, and there's, for example, they have municipal funding also there. So as more you wood you bring in your building, then you get more money. And it's also on the local level, next to other national grants they can have. So Munich also is really is a city who has money. There are also a lot of other cities in Germany. They struggle a lot even now. So um, I think for us as a DGMB, we always say we want to push the market and want to show that it's possible to build in a more sustainable way, more climate friendly, and also in an economic way. That there are buyers who see the added value of the building and even pay a little bit more. We tried that the last 15 years, but what we also see when there was the change that now also national subsidies are linked to DGMB certification, it scaled a lot. Yeah. So before it was a linear process, but now it was really exceptional in the last 2 or 3 years. So this is why I think at the end, I think some minimum criteria like we see in Denmark for build something new. So CO2 values could change a lot and bring the process much more further than maybe some voluntary certifications like we do. But it's a discussion process. I'm not sure if, as we in Germany, really will find there such a big lobby to define their CO2 benchmarks for new construction. I think this way is another approach. Maybe we see in 5 or 10 years. Maybe it's also there's a lot of efforts with that. We will see.
Yeah, thanks. So everybody taking different approaches. I think we did justice to most of the questions in the chat. I hope I didn't overlook anything. But just to me, it's very interesting how we heard a lot about, You know, this is a learning process in many ways. And you, Sarah, you talked a lot about you collecting data, etc. You want to see what's possible. You're incentivizing a little bit. But I'm wondering, it's very difficult, right? And Stephan talked about it, how there can be different definitions of embodied carbon. So is there a need over time? I mean, of course, first collecting data, doing research, but to have some international standards in order to be, because we need to decarbonize the building sector everywhere in the end, right? And perhaps that can also help build standards for developing building material. I don't know. I don't even know who to direct the question to. Perhaps somebody, there's a volunteer. Otherwise, I will volunteer you. But do you have an opinion about that? Sarah, perhaps?
I'm happy to start on the data scale. Vancouver and North America is definitely catching up with Europe. So definitely at this stage we need more regional data creation. And I think as it comes with all data, we expect initial data to not be as high resolution as we have on operational carbon. Regardless, I think it is crucial, and we are kind of trying to take similar approach as France to create an open database on whole building LCAs, and our federal government is developing LCI database, which is basically feeding to this LCA, whole building LCA. So I hope that it will be a standardized international approach, but the data availability, at least in Canada, is not as at the stage that we can share much beyond the production phase of materials.
Okay, great. And since we're over the time already, I did have a question regarding refurbishment, whether it all applies to new building maybe, and mostly for the beginning and not refurbishment. But we're past our time, so I think I have Takahiro Yamada, who wanted to conclude a little bit and wrap up, so that would be great.
Okay, thank you for Nicola, and thank you for everyone. I'm Takahiro, and I lead the Sustainable Building Unit at the OECD. So now we are over time, but as a closing remark, please allow me to take a moment to speak about our next steps. Our team, Sustainable Building Unit, is the only unit within the OECD that focuses on the building issues. And we've been conducting research and policy analysis on sustainable buildings. And to foster dialogue and share the energies, the OECD hosts the annual Sustainable Building Roundtable and bring together national and local governments. And the whole life carbon approach has been a key theme at the past two roundtables. And the OECD report, the zero carbon building in cities, is one of these outcomes. And this year, this roundtable will take place on October 9th and 10th. In this roundtable, we're going to further discuss whole life carbon policies across countries and cities, and then also discuss circularity, which is emerging key challenges. So if we warmly welcome the participation of government officials at both national and subnational levels. So if some of you are interested in this discussion, please feel free to reach out to us for more information. In addition, we'll also hold a task force meeting on real estate investment alongside this roundtable. Please go to the next slide. Decarbonizing the building sector requires massive private investment. So this project aims to examine the policy from the perspective of investment rather than technical standards. And next slide, please. This diagram shows the participants of this task force now. We are already engaged with a wide range of major stakeholders in the real estate sector, including investors, insurers, rating agencies, governments, and international organizations, and so on. So we encourage anyone interested in to contact us and join the conversation. We are welcome. And finally, thank you once again for this joining today's webinar. And we sincerely hope this webinar is useful to your work going forward. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks for that. And I think with that, well, we have seen that that there many further discussions would be fruitful, but we've connected, so that's good. And thank you very much for well, making this possible, and have a good evening. Some of us day and others afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Zara, I
you
saw
so
your
much.
message, so I will contact you later.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks
so much,
That
everybody.
was great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.